In May of 1971, when the last school bell of spring had finally gone quiet over Sumas, Washington, two 14-year-old boys, Ethan Cole and Mason Reed, set their minds on a river they'd never fished and a canyon they'd only ever stared at from the road. It was a Saturday that started before any parent's alarm, the air still cold enough to steam from their mouths as they rolled their bikes out into the gray dawn. They'd both heard the same talk for years, that the river curling out of that canyon could glitter with trout as if the water itself were spitting coins. But they had never pushed deeper than the mouth. That morning, they agreed without saying it, they wanted the hidden part, the place the map forgot. They stopped at the small market for sandwiches and glass-bottled sodas, a paper sack of licorice rattling against handlebars. Then came pedaling, miles of it, the kind of riding that chews a boy's legs and fills his head with nothing but road and breath and the brag of the day in front of him. Gravel shouldered them, root-tangled edges took over, at last the kind of riverbank arrived where no road pretends to be a path. They hid the bikes under alder and cedar, shouldered the rods and dented tackle tin, and stepped into a canyon that felt like a throat-swallowing light. They didn't have a point on a map, only an idea, good holes, deep eddies, places where trout hold the way secrets do. Sun leaked down through fur in torn ribbons. The river kept up its low, talking sound and the boys followed it, casting here and there, more walking than fishing, more looking than catching, happy just to be where the water ran narrow and cold and different. Close to 2 hours upstream, Mason's voice cut sideways from the river to the slope on their right. He had seen something flattened into the hillside, a shape that didn't belong with the broken rock and brush. They set the rods down, climbed, boots sliding on the grit. Up close, the object swallowed the last of what either of them could call natural, a broad slab of pale stone, bone-colored and too even on top, and in its center a conical spike that rose like a clean, sharp tooth. It felt arranged, almost ceremonial, some kind of bed or platform that a person would never build without a purpose. At the base of that spike sat a glass vial full of yellow liquid. The yellow had too much life in it, flower bright, wrong against the cold stone. The lid was stranger than the color, something like leather and not like leather, soft and textured and almost pore-marked. It resembled skin enough that their bodies knew it before their minds did, and both boys felt their shoulders lift at the same time. Mason's hand got there first, the way his hand always did. He prodded the lid with a finger and hissed a half-laugh. "What is that?" he said, not expecting an answer. He pinched the top and peeled it away. A smell rose out, sweet, not syrupy, not rot, nothing they could name as anything from a kitchen or forest. Ethan leaned in without choosing to, in both of them a small part of the mind gave way, like a latch unhooked by someone else's hand. The scent suggested a path through the moment. Drink, and you will know. Mason raised the bottle to his mouth and swallowed before he could second-guess. His face softened as if he'd been standing in too much light and stepped back under shade. "That's good," he said, and passed it to Ethan. Ethan didn't hesitate, didn't bargain with reason, the want came through him like thirst in the middle of August. He drank. The liquid was cool, smooth, more presence than flavor, and for a heartbeat it felt like everything right in the world had been reduced to one small act, now complete. They placed the vial back at the spike's base as if laying it down were part of some ritual neither had learned but both understood. Mason stretched out on the slab and Ethan followed, the stone's chill soaking their shirts, the sky blank and blanched above the canyon's mouth. Time slid. A fly landed on Ethan's lip and the tiny touch brought him back like a snapped twig. The light had stepped from morning into late afternoon, their shadows looked tired. Mason was still out, jaw slack, a shine of spit at one corner. Between them lay two ragged crescents of vomit, their own, bright and ugly against the stone. The sight tightened something behind Ethan's eyes. He reached for Mason's shin and shook. "Hey, wake up. That stuff, whatever it was, knocked us out. We were sick." Mason pushed himself up, blinking. He turned, saw the mess, and grimaced. Before either could say what came next, both leaned closer at once. The puddled mess moved. Not with flies, not with a heat shimmer or a trick of gaze. It shifted, as if something were deciding to separate itself from what held it. Ethan looked for the vial. It should have been sitting there, within reach, but glass doesn't vanish, and yet it had. He scanned the slab, the weeds, the downslope. The bottle was gone, as if it had only ever been an idea they'd agreed to share. "Let's go," Ethan said, his voice smaller than it should have been out here under all this sky. Mason didn't argue. They half slid, half ran down the slope, gathered their things, and followed the river's edge, the canyon narrower now, the trees asking them to be quiet. They rode toward town with the posture of boys who've accidentally stepped into a story they aren't big enough to carry, talking in clipped, sideways bits. What was it? Why did they drink? Why sleep like that? Why the moving sickness? Why the absence of the bottle? At first light on Sunday they met again, both swearing they just wanted to make sense of it, both feeling something else entirely. It pulled at them from behind the sternum, an insistence that was not desire or fear but a mixture of both. They pedaled and hiked as if that pull were a rope and they were fish on it. When the slab came into view through the trees, they hurried up the slope with the impulse of kids who believe speed can outrun fate. The scene lay changed and worse. Where each boy had thrown up, a small body now rested, half their size, laid in the very spots their sickness had marked. The forms were human and not. They had every arrangement of limb and feature required to impersonate a person, but not a hint of skin. Not flayed, no blood, no slick, but a smooth, dry exposure of muscle and tendon and pale ligature, set out as if for a diagram. The faces were uncarved pumpkins, soft, wrong, unfinished. The question that rose in Ethan's head had no words, only pressure. Mason made a sound low in his throat, then another, the noises of an animal torn between bite and flight. His eyes ran across the bodies and refused to land. The next second he spun and bolted, skidding down the slope, tearing brush, the canyon suddenly a chute to eject him. Ethan shouted his name and gave chase, but fear of looking away from what they had found pulled on him until he forced his eyes and legs to obey different orders. By the time he reached the river, Mason was already a diminishing shape. Ethan stumbled after him, lungs shredding, the trees pressing in. They reached the bikes and Mason folded beside a bush, knees to chest, head buried, shivering in the slow heat of late morning. Ethan stood for a moment because he didn't know how to kneel. "What happened to you up there?" he said, and Mason lifted his head with a face that looked like Mason's and didn't. "Was that real?" Mason asked. Ethan swallowed. "Did you see where they were?" "The exact places where," he couldn't say the last part. Mason stared downward again, as if the dirt might answer what a person couldn't. "They decided, or perhaps the decision decided them, they would come back tomorrow. If the bodies were still there, they would tell someone. If the bodies were gone, they would bury the day, in thought if not in soil." That night, sleep was a door that kept closing on Ethan's foot. Every time his mind tipped toward rest, the pictures rushed up, the yellow liquid, the sweet smell, the moving bile, the two small forms lying in the places he and Mason had emptied themselves. Worse was Mason's expression, that emptied, inhabited look, as if someone else had stepped inside and set his eyes in a new direction. Ethan rolled and rolled. The last clear thing he knew was wishing for morning. A shadow stood by his bed. There was no question of dream, the room held someone, close enough for Ethan to taste the movement of air. Something hissed through a small arc and pain turned the lights out. He woke to dirt in his mouth and rope on his wrists and ankles. It was dark except for a thin seam of light somewhere above. The smell of loam and wood and damp stone said cellar. He heard voice-shaped murmurs beyond a wall he couldn't see, the words too swaddled to make out. He had the sense that calling out would be like raising a hand for the teacher you don't want, and kept still. A door yawned with a wooden creak. Steps descended. A switch clicked, a bulb woke, not much of one, a tired circle of yellow that drew the basement out of shadow inch by inch. Ethan's head was turned toward the floor, the angle wrong for seeing who had come. Hands took his shoulders and rolled him to his back. The sight above him pinned his breath. Mason stood there. He wore different clothes, wrong ones, and his hair wasn't exactly as it had been hours ago, but it was Mason's face and Mason's body, and his expression was unfamiliar and empty. He stared down at Ethan as if seeing a picture he had to memorize. No sign of recognition crossed him. He stepped back into shadow and stopped, as if waiting for a cue. Footfalls again. A cane's tip tapped wood and a figure turned the corner, an old woman, small, bent, hair long and silver and snarled, cane gripped in two knuckles-tight hands. She moved with the slow certainty of someone who always arrives last and still expects to be first. She put her hand on Mason's shoulder and whispered into his ear. He nodded once, turned, and climbed the way he had come, leaving Ethan to the old woman and the bulb and the damp walls. She dragged a chair to the center of the room, planted it in front of Ethan, and sat. Her hair veiled most of her face. The way she held the cane across her knees felt like the way a judge holds a gavel. She stared at Ethan and he stared back, and a long, kneeling kind of time passed. Then several sets of feet came clattering down, quick and together. Ethan turned his head and saw something he understood too slowly and then all at once. Beside the boy who looked like Mason, another boy stood who looked like Ethan. Not a brother, not a cousin. Ethan. They came to stand behind the old woman as if they were regulars in a ritual. The old woman made a small motion with her hand, both boys leaned to her and she said something Ethan could not hear. They nodded, turned, and vanished back up the stairs as if withdrawn by a string. The old woman rose. She came close enough that Ethan could smell the old oils in her hair. She knelt. And when her face lifted in the light, Ethan saw eyes that didn't hold a person so much as a long, cold evening. Behind her shoulder, movement gathered, another Mason easing out from a shadow-damp corner, this one with the hair and clothes Ethan recognized. He moved on bare feet, raising a length of metal slowly, the pipe angled in his hand the way a man learns to bring down a lever. Ethan forced his face to calm, the way a rabbit does when a hawk tries to read its heartbeat, because any flicker at the wrong time would swing the old woman's gaze. The pipe came down in a single, ugly sound against the side of her skull. She crumpled forward onto Ethan, and a smell like rot sweet dust filled the space. Mason shoved her aside, breathing fast, hands already at Ethan's rope. "What is this?" Ethan whispered. "I don't know," Mason whispered back. "But did you see them? They look like us." "Where are we?" "Some kind of farm," Mason said. "In the woods. It's dark out. I think they were coming back for me, but I got loose. We have to go." They moved Ethan's numb limbs by degree, stumbling toward the stairs. Every plank they climbed sounded louder than it should have. Ethan kept picturing the door opening and the other Ethan and the other Mason filling it like a mirror that walks. But the door stayed a door, and they eased it open and stepped into air that held the end of night. A house shape loomed, a barn outline cut a darker wedge out of the dark, and yellow bleached up under a door. "That way," Ethan whispered, pointing away from the light. They half jogged, half tangled into timber, branches slapping and hands raised. Their minds had no map, only the instruction to get away, which sometimes is enough. At the edge of the trees Ethan made the mistake of turning to mark a place he would never come back to and saw two shapes standing in the barn light, his own outline and Mason's, watching them go. "They see us," Ethan breathed, and they disappeared into the dark green. They ran until running went out of them. Somewhere the forest mounded and gave back only silence. Ethan's lungs felt like they had teeth. When he finally stopped, he realized the running had split them. There was no Mason beside him. He said Mason's name and it didn't go more than 3 trees. He whispered it and let the whisper die. Fear asked him to beat the brush until he found his friend, reason reminded him that the boys who were not boys could be anywhere between any 2 trees. He sank behind a fallen log and made himself smaller than his breath. It was the kind of still that finds ways to grow on a person. He might have slept, the boundary blurred. A scream cracked the quiet open, far and torn and maybe human and maybe Mason's. Ethan's body twitched toward standing and his mind shoved it back. He slid his legs and the sticks under him broke with a sound that was surely loud enough to bring whatever walked here. He put his face to the log and peered under a low, dark arch. A figure moved through the shadows, close enough that Ethan could make out his own jawline, his own nose, the slope of his own brow. The other Ethan came on in a kind of hunter's crouch, turning his head to listen to something only he could hear. He stopped 5 feet from the log and made a noise that a throat shouldn't know how to make, like a whistle that had been cut and taught to bleed. Ethan pressed himself into bark. The other Ethan turned and moved off with a motion that left the world feeling scraped. Ethan waited, because waiting was what the animal inside him demanded. When he finally stood, he moved in the opposite direction the double had taken. He walked until sky sifted through fur to pale and then to broken blue. A hill lifted him high enough to see a town in the distance. He walked toward it as if out on a slack line. The town's first door was the first door he knocked on. The man who answered had the Canada plain in his vowels. Ethan blinked at that because Sumas sits tipped against the border, but he hadn't thought he could have run so far. The man drove him to a phone, and the phone made a line from this place to his place, and his parents' voices broke into his head and then broke into sobs. When Ethan made it home, Mason had already made it home too. Ethan rode his bike to Mason's house the next day because a person doesn't know what else to do when the world's shape goes wrong except check whether a friend is still a friend. Mason stood on the porch and listened to Ethan try to talk, gave short answers, gave no answers, grew smaller in his eyes. He didn't want to tell what happened in the woods. He didn't want to retell what he hadn't told yet. When Ethan backed his bike away, he looked up once and saw Mason staring at him, and it felt like being weighed and found wrong by someone who knew all the measures. An idea pressed into Ethan that he didn't want to let in, that the boy on the porch might not be the boy from the creek. He pedaled home with that idea sitting on the top tube like a passenger. For a week, Ethan let fear scab over. It never did. The picture of the slab and the 2 small bodies lay on his pillow every night. He made himself go back because not going back felt like agreeing to lose his own story. He hiked alone, cooled by the river's breath, warmed by the certainty that this was something a person should not do alone and doing it anyway. He came up on the slab from below. Before his eyes crawled over its flatness to the stone spike, movement on the ridge line above caught him. Mason stood there, or the boy who wore Mason's face did. The two of them held one another's eyes for a time long enough to decide things that would not be said. Ethan turned and walked away, and the canyon felt like it let him go because it had nothing else to do with him. Ethan's parents tried to turn the boy's account into something that could be handled by daylight. They believed him more than they could afford to, and it cost them sleep and miles. They drove roads that frayed into 2-track, then into tire scars, then into nothing. Woods opened onto farms and farms closed into woods. No cellar door in their county, and the next ones over consented to be the door Ethan had passed through. The story had a shape that wouldn't stand still: a house, a barn, a light, a cellar, a woman, 2 boys who were themselves and weren't. The only part they could touch was the stone slab itself. When they hiked in and found it, it was there exactly as Ethan reported, and there was no accounting for how such a heavy thing had come so far into a canyon with no road and no trail and no marks of men. The parents stood with their hands on their hips like people do when they have nothing else to hold, and the slab held them with the same cold non-answer it had given the boys. Back in town, the river ran the way it always had. The market sold the same sandwiches. The bikes leaned against the same porches. But a door had been opened somewhere that did not close. Ethan walked by it every time he walked past a mirror. Mason's smile, when it came at all, did not reach his eyes and seemed borrowed from a person who had heard about smiles and wanted to try one on. The 2 boys stopped meeting where they had always met. They began to take different routes, to have different hours, to learn different silences. On certain days when the sky lowered and the hills drew in, Ethan felt a pull inside him like the one that had dragged him back to the slab, the sensation of an answer that couldn't be heard. He learned to let it pass. He learned not to follow. The story Ethan finally told his parents, months later, when words stopped dissolving in his mouth, sounded like a dare to disbelieve. He started with getting lost, because that was easier to say than the truth, that he had been taken from his bed after midnight by a figure that moved like a person and didn't stand like one. He told them about the cellar and the old woman and the two boys in the doorway and the pipe, and he told them about the scream in the forest that might have been Mason's and might have been some other thing learning to use Mason's voice. He told them about knocking at the first door of the first town he could see and being told, in gentle surprise, that he was in Canada. The parents tried to turn the telling into something police could hold, but the facts had the texture of a wet rope. Even the parts that could be shown, the slab itself, refused to arrange themselves into a story that would behave under fluorescent light. A deputy said that people hauled stone for stupid reasons all the time. A game warden said he'd never seen anything like that slab on any map of the canyon. A neighbor with a hard mouth said boys make things up and then make men spend weekends proving that the world is as boring as it was yesterday. None of them had answers for how a glass vial could taste like the correctness of the moment and how a person could look directly at something his mind could not admit to being there. There are stories that end with a door locking and the sound of a key turning because we like the feeling of keeping the bad thing on the other side. This one did not choose that shape. It kept walking around the town on long legs, glancing into windows. Sometimes Ethan dreamed the slab and woke with the taste of something sweet and wrong on his tongue. Sometimes Mason walked by him with a gait that belonged on somebody else and Ethan had to grip a fence post to stay in this world. Every so often, hikers found their way up that canyon and came back to talk in low voices about a pale stone bed and a conical spike and the sense that standing near it means something like standing near a machine that has only one job and is waiting for you to touch the button. They would laugh and then not laugh. People decided not to go back. The slab stayed. No one came with a winch. No one brought a crane. The canyon kept its own inventory. On quiet afternoons, when the light in Sumas turned the sides of houses into old paper, Ethan sometimes imagined that there were boys up near the Canadian line who wore his face and Mason's and were figuring out how to pass in a town where the market sells the same sandwiches and the river runs the same and everyone pretends that those facts are enough to prove what else must be true. He would blink and shake the thought away and try to think only about the ordinary work of being a person, chores, homework, the long, boring kindness of family. The story that Ethan told was, to anyone not him, an unbelievable one. He knew that. He offered one last sentence when he finished, the strangest appeal a son can make to parents who want to keep him inside the boundary of what they can protect. He said that if they wanted, he would take them there himself. They never asked him to. And yet the canyon is still there, and the river still pulls cold down from the trees, and somewhere up a slope that looks like every other slope is a slab more patient than whatever fear or wonder a person can carry up to it. Maybe the thing that most changed the course of two boys' lives was not the vial or the old woman or the copy boys under the barn light. Maybe it was the moment they stood on a stone someone had dragged to a place no one should, looked at something shaped like a purpose, and chose to take in what it offered. There are versions of this told to this day, changed around the edges to suit the teller, but they all end in the same place. Ethan Cole came home after a night that was not his own, and Mason Reed did too. One of them kept looking out from his own face as if it were a borrowed mask. The other learned to walk away from the part of the woods where the air still smells a little too sweet some afternoons when the sun has been on stone for hours. And if you ask the old men who fish where the water slows, they'll tell you they don't go past the mouth anymore, not since the year school let out and the canyon decided to take an interest in who came to visit. For those who trade in the tidy ending, police tape, newspaper lines, a photograph with a white border, this story does not oblige. It leaves you where it left them, with a sense that some places wait for choices, and that sometimes the smallest bottle in the loneliest clearing is the loudest invitation a person will ever hear. If you still want to know whether the slab is real, whether the spike stands where it stood, whether the canyon keeps what it is given, you can follow the river out from town and let the trees close behind you the way a theater curtain does. You can walk without a plan, say you're looking for trout, and listen. If you reach a place where the air carries a sweetness you cannot name and your mind says this is right and your stomach says this is wrong, you've come as close as anyone needs to. Turn around. Go home. Or don't. Stories like this one are indifferent to advice. They lean forward, waiting, and if you put your hand out, they will put something in it that looks like the answer to a question you haven't asked yet. That's the story Ethan finally told, months after he'd first mumbled about being lost. He said it plain, and he ended it the only way he could, by offering to lead anyone who doubted back to the place where believing or not believing stops mattering because the stone is under your feet and the river is whispering and the sky is the same color it was the day two boys walked into it and never completely came back.